Right, we've got a quorum already, so we will start part 4 now. And this part is on Hospital G. May I welcome Ophelia and Wilson. They represent the planning department. Hospital G is different from other hospitals in that there was some development on the site by a developer. I don't have anything to declare, but then in order to avoid any public perception about any possible conflict of interest, I will invite the deputy chairman to chair the meeting. So we know that Mr. Abraham Sheck has chosen this approach because he wants to show that he is whiter than white. So please bear in mind that I have this P license in front of me. So we'll ask Mr. Alan Leung to kick off, and it's good that we can have a senior counsel to lead this case. Yes, thank you, Chairman. So this is a hospital in District G. This is a private hospital, and it's a profit-making private hospital. In other words, they are not like the hospitals which are subject or should be subject to the 2 salient requirements. So this chapter is about whether the land use is suitable and appropriate. And we are also looking at the value for money aspect based on the planning perspective. Chairman, with regard to Hospital G, perhaps I can say something about the background. In the 80s, it was the government's assessment that District G, in which Hospital G is located, needed a hospital and according to the evidence available, it was felt that the district needed a hospital providing at least 600 beds. And in fact, in the year 2000, the estimate was revised to 800 beds. And so in 1988, there was the first tender. Or rather in 1981, there was the first tender. And the successful bidder had to provide a hospital of not less than 400 beds, but not more than 600 beds. And no bids were received. Then let's now go to paragraph 4.5 of our report. That's page 55 of the English version. Chairman, as you can see, in October 1981, the then M&H department informed the then land authority that A, providing 1.922 hectares for building a hospital of 200 to 400 beds was deemed appropriate, and you can see that in A, the number 600 had already been adjusted downwards to 400. Then B, to reduce the minimum number of beds from 400 to 200 with a possibility of phased development into 400 beds at some later date. So, Chairman, so why did the M&H department inform the then Land Authority of the 2 points? What happened in the first tender in 1981, leading the M&D department to provide such information to the then Land Authority? Mr. Cole. Chairman, according to the then planning standards, the number of beds within a range would be regarded as in compliance with the planning standards. But then in the first tender, no bids were received, and so the department might want to give the new hospital some flexibility when it started operation. Director, according to our records, no bids were received in the first tender, and so the Sha Tin district officer had a discussion with the relevant sector, and the district officer learned that the reduction in the number of beds would increase the chance of success of the tendering exercise. The M&H department was consulted subsequently. At the time, there was the Code of Planning. Now we have the Hong Kong Planning Standards and Guidelines. And according to the standard at the time, reserving a 1.922 hectare site was regarded as in compliance with the requirement. Now, at that time, we were talking about a standard of 50 square meters per bed. Mr. Alan Leung. Yes, of course, I understand that more flexibility in operation will attract more bidders, since bidders can achieve the target number of beds in phases. But then the maximum number of beds was reduced from 600 to 400. And the minimum number was reduced from 400 to 200. And the maximum was reduced from 600 to 400. So why was it that the area of 1.922 hectares could remain unchanged? And may I refer to 4.10, page 58 of the English version, Chairman? This hospital F, of course, is a non-profit making hospital. It was granted LG 8 and LG 9. And it got only 0.79 hectares for providing not less than 300 beds. So why was it that the area of 1.922 hectare could remain the same? Director, at the time, the planning standard was to reserve 50 square meters for each bed. And assuming that the bidder would provide a total of 400 beds in phases, then the area reserved should be 2 hectares. So 1.922 is within this limit. But then initially you said that the maximum number should be 600 beds. So in other words, 1.922 would not be enough for 600 beds. Now, in fact, the Code of Planning was merely for reference. Now, usually public hospitals would follow the standard. So, as not as simple as a simple multiplication, because if we have 600 times 50 square meters, that would give you 3 hectares. So as the maximum number of beds was reduced by 1/3, then according to the original logic, the site area should also be reduced by 1/3 accordingly. Yes, Director? Chairman, as far as I understand, at that time the M&H department also was in charge of public hospitals. Public hospitals made reference to the planning standard, but then for private hospitals, usually a private operator would identify a suitable site and then make an application to the administration. Director of Lands? Yes, thank you. Perhaps I can explain the background why we had 600 beds initially. As Mr. Leung has pointed out, the site was 1.9 hectares in area, and so if you do a simple division, then it should be suitable for a 400-bed public hospital. But then before the first tender, there was one interested party which indicated that 600 beds might be provided, and so in the first tender, the administration decided to use 600 beds as the maximum, and that was why in the first tender, the range was 400 to 600, but then no bids were received, and then there were some who said that the number should not be rigidly set at 400, and so in the second tender, the range was 200 to 600. In other words, the maximum was not changed. But of course, if the maximum number of beds was provided, the site would be too small. But then if the minimum number was provided, and given that private hospitals might provide facilities of a higher standard, then the site should not be regarded as too big. Now, Chairman, now the PAC is here to collect evidence. We want to know the following. Now, the site was intended for hospital development, and it was to provide 200 to 600 beds. Why was it that later there was a private residential development on the site? May I now refer to Table 5, Chairman. And I think we should look at Table 5 together with Appendix D. Now, Chairman, from 1986 onwards, Operator G applied to the Lands Department for developing the whole site for residential purpose, and the application was rejected. And then in 1988, Operator G again applied to the Lands Department for partitioning the land lot with a portion for a residential development, and again the application was rejected. That was the second time the application was rejected. And then, since 1994 up to April 2000, Operator G applied repeatedly for changing part of the hospital site to residential use. The applications were all rejected. And then may I refer to the next page, page 57 of the English version. In May 2000, Operator G lodged a request with the Town Planning Board for rezoning the eastern portion of the hospital site from GIC and open space to residential development. In its request, Operator G also proposed to extend or expand the hospital by providing additional 200 beds. The Town Planning Board agreed to the rezoning request in June in the same year.
So after a number of applications to change the land use for residential purposes, and those applications were rejected by the Lands Department. Then why is it that in June 2000, the Town Planning Board all of a sudden agreed to the rezoning request? Why? Was the then department, now is the Department of Health, at that time it was called the Medical and Health Department. Why didn't the Lands Department say something in the Town Planning Board process, or did it say something and then can we be informed of the process? Chairman, let me have a go. From 1986 up to the point the Town Planning Board agreed to the rezoning request, it was a long period. At different times, but there were different considerations on the part of the government. As you can see from the table, in 1986, the operator made an application. Also in 1988, let me say something about the reasons for the rejections. Well, actually, the hospital was not yet built. That is to say, the land was granted for a hospital in 1982. No construction has started, and the operator wanted to change the land use. Having consulted the EXCO, the government thought, why do you want to make such a hasty application? There was a need for a hospital. And the operator said he could not find an operator to run the hospital. There were financial difficulties, but the government acted as the gatekeeper, and the operator was asked to find someone to run the hospital. You should try to get the money needed. If you failed, I can get the land back. But then the applicants subsequently built the hospital. It was commissioned. The first phase was commissioned in 1994. And then there were other applications to change the land grant, and also to seek a rezoning request from the Town Planning Board. And if the Town Planning Board approved a planning application, the Lands Department cannot refuse to go along with the statutory planning process, and that's why there was the application made or lodged with the Town Planning Board. And there were different considerations since the application was made so many years later than the first ones. Other colleagues may supplement in due course. Well, I think I can give the floor to other members now. Mr. Chan Ha-kan, I want to follow up on paragraph 4.3. The director or the audit has given us a plan. When the operator built the hospital, all facilities were placed on the western portion, and the majority part of the eastern portion was left vacant for a long time. This gives rise to suspicion. What's the purpose of leaving the eastern portion vacant? And the director also said, in responding to previous questions, that operator G didn't want to build a hospital in the first place. He wanted to build residential developments. So the government knew about the operator G's layout plans, and the facilities were located on the western portion, Didn't you think that there was something untoward in the whole process? We don't have anyone representing the developer here. Perhaps let's see what the government departments want to say about this. I just want to know if there's any loophole in the mechanism. So it's just about your comment, your observations, not about giving evidence. Well, if we look at this plan, in the first phase, they built on one side. I cannot say that just because of this piece of information, the grantee that wanted to build a residential development, I don't think I can say that. Well, there were some ideas that they tried to consider. They tried to find someone to run the hospital, and the full premium for this site, for this hospital site, was paid. But then there were difficulties they encountered, which I cannot comment. But in 1994, the hospital was finally built. Secretary, I'm not talking about this example. I'm talking about hospitals. Very often, the facilities will be located on one portion, and then the remaining portions can be used flexibly later. So it doesn't just happen to this hospital. I would like to refer to paragraph 4.12. There's an observation from the Audit Commissioner, and that is unless there is any a breach of lease conditions or part or whole of the site concerned is required for public purpose, the government does not have grounds to regain possession of the site or any part thereof once the land is granted or sold. From this example, Chairman, and I would like to make use of a more extreme example. Say I get the land and I use 10% of it for a hospital. I leave the remaining 90% vacant for some other purposes in the future. If this happens, will the administration find this acceptable? Or under the existing mechanism, if you are faced with such a situation, what can you do to plug the loophole? Would you be ready? Would you be willing to allow this loophole to continue to exist? Say I want to build a 600-bed hospital, and now it's a 400 beds. Would you be willing to give the grantee the same site, aspect as this one? Well, we don't want to have too much flexibility. The new sites put up for tender for hospitals have already got new conditions in the lease, and that is during the validity of the lease. There's no change of land use allowed. So for the new 4 sites that you are going to grant for new hospitals, such conditions are there. But when you get a land for a private hospital, they have a chance to change or modify the lease. That's in 2011. Well, this is a for-profit hospital. This is not the same as the other non-profit hospitals. Do you think that you have been taken advantage of in the process? Director, I think I should put it like this. The government cannot suddenly say that I would like to have a lease modification because I should have given you a smaller site, or I want to take that part of the site, because the grantee got the land through an open tendering exercise. It's unlike the other cases where we granted the land through private treaties. They get this land through open tender, and they are required to build a hospital with 200 to 400 beds, and they have delivered this. So we cannot say that with hindsight we shouldn't have given you this big site. and then we try to deprive the land rights, and we impose a modification on the grantee in exchange for a smaller site. We can't do that. Well, you know that in area of Zone G, there's still a shortage of hospital beds. And then subsequently, there was the Prince of Wales Hospital expansion project. When you granted the land for a private hospital and you haven't achieved the original objective, and still you allow them to have a residential development, didn't it go against the original objective? The two departments, the Lands Department and the Food and Health Bureau, seem to have taken up the conflicting policies. Would the two policy bureaus respond? Please restate the questions again. When you granted the land, it's because in District G there was a lack of sufficient hospital beds, and it's hoped that a private hospital will be built to solve the problem. And when you consider the land use, the change of land use, you allow the number of beds to be reduced, and you allowed residential development in part of the site granted. In District G, the same problem remained. There was a public hospital expansion project subsequent to that approval. Why was the policies not consistent? Well, I think when the applications came before the Town Planning Board, the Hospital Authority had been consulted. Well, why was there a contradiction in the policies? I cannot say anything on behalf of the Town Planning Board. Can we have someone from the Town Planning Board? Ms. Wong. Of course, I have to say that I'm not here representing the Town Planning Board. I'm from the Planning Department. So I'm speaking on behalf of the Planning Department. In the change of land use, which is a very lengthy process, a few years of time was spent. The applicant put in not for a change of land use. It's not an application for a change of land use, but a Section 16 application to change or to build a residential development on a GIC site. There were two applications. In the first application, the Metro Planning Committee under the Town Planning Board rejected the application. After the application was rejected, well, and it was mainly because of the departure from the planning intention for GIC site. And it was considered that there were no sufficient justifications to support the application. In the second application, the applicant proposed some new elements. And that is, while they would carry out a residential development, they would also going to build 3 more stories in the main hospital block with 200 additional beds. And it was thoroughly discussed by the committee under the Town Planning Board. And it was considered that the applications did not deviate from the planning guidelines, but it was somewhat a deviation from the planning intention of GIC site. And there were also other problems. And in the Town Planning Board, there were members with different views. It was an application under Section 16. At that time, there was no provision for public consultation. So there was no chance to consult the public. And some members thought that the land would not be required for the hospital because 200 more beds would be provided by the expansion of the made hospital block, so that application was rejected. You're talking about the case heard in May? Well, in February, 2000. The first time was May 1999, the second February 2000. But there were some outstanding issues left behind. The Town Planning Board informed the applicant that if the land is not required for the hospital or for other GIC purposes, there should be a request for rezoning. And that is to say, the Town Planning Board think that the land use cannot be changed through a Section 16 application, but they could apply for a rezoning. And then there will be gazetto and a proper hearing and public consultation. Affected people can attend the Town Planning Board to give their views and grounds. So the applicant was so informed. And that's why in June 2000, the applicant submitted a rezoning request, a rezoning application to the Town Planning Board.
And that proposal or application was accepted by the Town Planning Board. We then formally revised or amended the layout plan. There was gazetto, 6 formal objections were received. The Town Planning Board formed an objection hearing committee to listen to the objectors. And after the first hearing, the Town Planning Board changed the ROB zoning back to GIC. And then there was another gazetto, and then there were further objections. And the Town Planning Board considered objections and further objections and decided that the site should be rezoned back to residential. But what was the rationale for the Town Planning Board's decision? The Town Planning Board considered a number of points. The board noted that in Sha Tin district, there was a shortage of 890 hospital beds based on a standard of 5.5 beds per 1,000 people. In fact, the Town Planning Board consulted the Hospital Authority. The Hospital Authority gave the board some advice. And concerning the standard of 5.5 beds per 1,000 people, that was a territory-wide formula. But then at that time, the territory was divided into 5 regions: Hong Kong East, Hong Kong Island, Kowloon East, Kowloon West, NT East, NT West, 5 regions. And Hospital G was in NT East. According to the Hospital Authority, the standard should apply to the region, not to a particular district. And then by 2006, the shortage of hospital beds in NT East would be 250. That was what the Hospital Authority told the Town Planning Board. And the Hospital Authority said that it had no plans to find suitable sites in NT East to meet the shortfall. And the Hospital Authority was asked whether there were enough private hospital beds in the district. And the Hospital Authority said that it would not comment on the adequacy or otherwise of private hospital beds. As Ms. Ling has pointed out, private hospitals operate on a commercial basis based on market supply and demand. And the Town Planning Board also noted that the site was a private site. It was privately owned, that was. And the applicant provided the required number of beds in accordance with the lease and the grant. Now, because in the lease, it was said that the operator had to provide at least 200 beds, and the operator had already provided 212. And the operator told the Town Planning Board that it would provide a further 200 beds. So the Town Planning Board noted that the operator had fulfilled the minimum requirement. It was not sort of duty bound to provide more beds, but it had promised to provide an extra 200 beds. And then SWD and other departments were asked whether the site was needed for GIC use, for example, schools and so on and so forth. But then because that site was not really very conveniently located, the departments concerned said that they did not need the site for GIC use. And as a result, the Town Planning Board felt that the site could be used for other purposes. So the Town Planning Board looked at alternative uses, including residential use. The Town Planning Board was of the view that the development density was in line with the density in the nearby areas. The residential use was compatible with nearby residential use. There were no adverse impacts in terms of traffic and other aspects. And also, with the approval of the application, there would be 200 more beds provided at the hospital. And so the Town Planning Board finally decided that the site could be rezoned residential. So we've been given a very detailed reply. New members were interested in this, and so I gave Ms. Wong a little bit more time to give her reply. All right, Mr. Wong Yok-man. Thank you. Now we had a foolish, a stupid government versus a smart developer. So my first question is for the Director of Audit. Were you aware of the facts described by the DD just now? Yes. So you are telling us that the government should learn from this experience. Now this part 4 is a short part. You know, if the government opens its doors wide, and if it allows people to get as much as they want, of course people will come to get what they want to get. Now, I think there are a lot of loopholes that the developer, or there were a lot of loopholes that the developer could make use of. I would not say that the developer, in fact, had the intention right at the outset. But now, can I ask the planning department this question? Now, of course, we have to make the maximum use of the potential of a site. When the site was granted, it was intended for hospital use. So will you still allow such a loophole? Will you allow such things to happen during your term? And perhaps the Secretary for Development can also give a reply, and maybe the chairman may say he doesn't need to reply. It's up to you to decide. All right, Mr. Chan. This is about the future, but of course you can choose not to reply because this question is not directly relevant to this report. Now, as it has been pointed out, the tendering conditions for hospital sites have already changed. They are no longer the same. And if one wants to find a site for hospital use, the planning department in deciding whether the site is a suitable site for hospital use, looks at a lot of different factors. Their approach has also changed. Perhaps the DD can supplement. Yes, please be concise. Yes, Chairman, we do very detailed analysis. We fix the development potential or scale of each site, plot ratio, site coverage, and most importantly, height restrictions. So these are clear parameters which have been firmly laid down. And so it's quite unlikely that there can be extra stories added to an existing building, like what we saw in Hospital G. So I think the audit has pointed out the problems and has come up with recommendations. But then it seems that the officials felt that they were not in the wrong. Now, in fact, the government provided the right conditions for the developer to get what it wanted. So yesterday at the FC, we were tricked, we were trapped, but in this case, the government was not trying to trap the developer, but on the contrary, the government was in fact inviting the developer to get benefits. 4.13 to 4.19, due process for change of land use. You have to get the town planning board's approval for change of land use zoning, and then you have to get the lands department's approval for change of lease conditions. And then may I refer to 4.17. It was said that the DH had no particular comment. In other words, now in fact the DH used to have reservations, but then with EXCO's approval or following EXCO's approval, a DH no longer objected to the proposed lease modification. So we want to really know why EXCO really gave its approval. And also, we can't help suspecting that the DH no longer raised an objection because of the pressure it felt following EXCO's approval. Dr. Chen, in fact, the DH did give written comments, and then DH knew that EXCO had given the approval for the rezoning of the site, and so the DH did not give further views on the rezoning. And how did you know of the EXCO's approval? Did you have access to the EXCO paper? We received the application from the hospital, and we sought information from the lands department. Mr. Wong Yuk-man would like to know how you knew of the EXCO's approval. Was it that you received an email? We received a memo. Director of Audit, do you have anything to add with regard to the EXCO records in relation to para 4.17? I've got nothing to add. Ms. Wong? Chairman. So the outline zoning plan was amended. Town planning board had the responsibility to submit the amendments together with all the objections to the EXCO. We submitted all those to EXCO. So did EXCO come back to you? Of course, we the EXCO made a decision, and the revised outline zoning plan had to be published and gazetted. In fact, under the town planning ordinance, there are statutory steps to follow, and we followed each and every step. But we're not talking about your responsibility. I'm asking about the DFH's role. So you said there was a memo, and so you were aware of EXCO's approval. Director, we learned that the rezoning was approved, and so we had no further comments. So I want to know whether you felt that you were subject to some pressure. We will have to have your reply for the record. No pressure.
Operator G used the remaining 46% of the site for a luxurious residential development. There's nothing they could do about it, because they put up good justification to support his application. According to the Deputy Director, it was a legitimate and justified application. But the impression that the public gain is that you are transferring benefits to the property developer. You make a wrong assessment in the first place. What's the public perception? Just read the newspapers. The two secretaries, don't you think that public perception is important? Once this audit report is published, there's some public perception. Don't you think that the perception is important? I know this is a method of taking evidence, but perhaps the two secretaries can try to respond on this question about public perception. Maybe you should be brief, or you may choose to remain silent. Well, of course, we would listen to the public at any time. Mr. Porchan, any supplement? I have nothing to add. Well, this is the standard official line to take. That's just expected. Again, it's time to take remedial action to prevent the recurrence. So what can we say? What more can we say? The incident is laid out very clearly. I think there's an observation or recommendation from the Director of Audit. It said that the administration should learn a lesson from this. And this case has reflected inadequacies at the planning stage of the land use. Once this is a site has been allocated for sale for a special purpose, as for example for hospital services, it will be difficult for the government to take back possession of the site unless there is a significant breach of lease conditions or land resumption for public purpose. Given such a constraint, when you grant or sell the land for hospital services, you should not allow any loopholes to exist that people can take advantage of. You must promise us in this public hearing that in respect of the Director of Audit's recommendation for this particular part, he said that the selling of land must be carefully planned. Very careful and thoughtful planning with tight parameters should be set to regulate the intended use of the land granted at the very beginning. I would like the two secretaries to give a pledge to the public here. Secretary? Well, land is so valuable and scarce. If a site is earmarked for a private hospital, I will do whatever I can to make sure that it's used for the intended planning and purpose. Mr. Porchan? I've said that as a matter of fact, we are able to prevent the recurrence of the incident regarding Hospital G now. And when I testified, and also the Director of Health already said this, and that is in January 2011, and that is a year or so before this audit report, EXCO approved a new set of procedure in relation to the granting of land for private hospitals. You may wish to refer to page 57 of the Chinese version. And Ms. Wong, the Deputy Director of Planning, also told you that, that they would consider very objective factors in deciding the size of the lot to be granted. So we have actually taken action, concrete action, to respond to your concerns. Mr. Kenneth Leung, have you raised your hand? Yes, I have. Maybe we can return to table 5. I want to ask some more questions. I would like to have an in-depth discussion on what happened during different stages. First, the tendering exercise in 1982. Which departments were represented in the tendering board? MNHD and were MNHD and Lands Department included? Can we be given some information here? Ms. Ling? Well, this is an exercise whereby the highest bidder won the bid. The relevant departments would sit down and devise the tendering terms. The Lands Department was represented, and then Sha-Tin, the TDD office, and also the health-related departments were represented in the process. But when the tenders were received, actually the highest bidder, higher tender would win. So basically it's about looking at the quoted prices. So it was a simple exercise of looking at who is the highest bidder. Do you have any information as to which departments were involved in that part? I have no information now. According to Ms. Ling, well, you say that the site would go to the highest bidder. You are not going to consider the background of the bidder, whether the bidder has ever run a hospital or has got the financial ability to pay. So if I give you the highest bid, I will get the site. Did you also consider the background and financial capabilities of the bidders? Because obviously, Operator G got the land, and in 1986, Operator G said he had a lot of difficulties and he could not operate a hospital there. Ms. Ling, I was talking about the tender conditions. The departments work out those, and then we invite tenders. All the tender documents were assessed by the Central Tendering Board. That was the tendering Central Tendering Board back then. And then there was a contract entered into with the successful bidder, and a deadline was imposed for the commission to be constructed and operational. But in the process, he encountered difficulties, and there were different applications made in 1986 and 1988. I think the question is, did you consider the background and capabilities of the bidders, whether he can actually operate a hospital? Well, from the joint tendering documents, it was a system whereby the highest bidder would win the bid, and a financial report is required on his ability to run a hospital. But notwithstanding such a report, if the outside environment subsequently changed, there was little we could do to control it. So in other words, was the background or the experience of the bidder part of the consideration? What about experience? Well, from the tendering document, this was not considered as a factor. That was a long time ago. Well, I'm surprised by that you allow someone without experience to try to get a grant of land to run a hospital. And in 1988 and 1994, Operator G applied to the Lands Department for change of land use on a number of times. I want some more information about this. From 1986 to 2000, the applicant wanted to change the land use. The application was submitted to the Lands Department, but in 2000, the operator submitted an application to the Town Planning Board. Were there any changes to the government procedure? Well, I think it's about a different application. The nature was different. Maybe Ms. Wong can supplement. Well, when we talk about the OZP, Outline Zoning Plan, it's a statutory plan. If you want to build a residential development on a GIC site, you must get the Town Planning Board's approval, or you submit a Section 16 application and you are approved to change the GIC land use. Or you can have an approval to change the zoning from GIC to residential. Otherwise, no development is allowed, even if the Lands Department gives the approval. So it's a different channel, Islam. Let me turn to the lease. Mr. Paul Chan, Secretary for Development, has told us that as of now, we are not going to expect a repeat of the same incident. Were there any forfeiture clauses in the original lease? I don't know how to put it in Chinese. I'm talking about forfeiture in part or in whole. And that is to say, if the land has been granted and the operator has failed to construct a hospital within the deadline, would you be able to forfeit the land? Well, the grantee of this site was asked to deliver a hospital within a certain time limit. If the time limit is up and the hospital is not constructed, we can take back the land. But subsequently, the hospital was constructed, and the number of beds was in line with our requirement. It's up to 600. Well, you can see also from the table that there were extensions required, and then they have to pay a premium for the approval of extensions. Again, I want to talk about Table 5. In May 2000, Operator G proposed an expansion of the hospital by constructing additional stories to provide 200 more beds. May I assume that in constructing the hospital, they already made provisions for a few more stories to be built later? If not, well, they will have to make the foundation ready for a few more stories. Is my assumption correct? Well, Operator G is not represented here, but can we deduce from objective circumstances that the operator had this plan in mind? Director or Secretary? Or is it that no one can answer this question? Or is a hypothetical or a question of the deduction? Well, in September 2001, Operator G applied to build on the 46% of the site for a residential development. Ms. Wong said the Town Planning Board did consider some factors, and one of those was the provision of 200 more beds. That's not in the original lease conditions. That was one of the important factors considered by the Town Planning Board. Then that would give rise to more questions. If they provide 200 more beds and you allowed them to rezone the remaining portion of the site, actually the two are not related. Can I propose to provide 500 niches in a new columbarium? And you only considered whether there were objectors and whether the other 16% or 46% would be compatible. But if you considered that we should return the 46% of the site as in August 2004, would the government be just getting the amount of the premium, i.e. $609.43 million in such an auction? But the land had already been sold through an auction to the grantee. The land was owned by the grantee, so there was no question of doing a retendering exercise.
As to whether he sought to change the land use zoning in accordance with established procedures, an explanation has already been given to members by the planning department. So, in fact, we merely dealt with the case according to established procedures. Now, because I think there should have been a forfeiture clause. Yes, the site had already been tendered, but then it was lying waste. Now, in 2004, I believe if the site had been retendered, the premium would have been more than $600 million. We're talking about value for money studies. Now, if that site had been auctioned in the open market, of course, that would have been a new price. I don't know what it is. But then forfeiture can only be done if there are good grounds. Is it that, Secretary, if there are no irregularities, no forfeiture can occur? Now, in this case, Chairman, all the grants or these conditions were complied with, and so there was really no room for us to regain possession. All right, I believe time's up for this round. I have no further questions. Mr. Alan Leung. Now, I'm concerned as to why we had laymen guiding the non-laymen or the experts. And, of course, by experts, I mean the D of H. I would like to refer to Appendix D now, Chairman. And that's page 82 to 83 of the English version. We can see that the DH had all along objected to the application of for change of land use by operator G with regard to the 46%. In December 1998, Operator G submitted a planning application to the Town Planning Board for residential development on the undeveloped portion of the hospital site. The DH had no objection to the application, and then in view of the persistent low occupancy of the hospital, even in terms of good financial environment, blah, blah, blah. Alright, so, and then in November 1999, Operator G submitted a planning application to the Town Planning Board. So that was the Section 16 application referred to by Ms. Wong. And here it says that the DH had reservation in supporting the proposal. And then E, consideration on the proposed change of land use was more a matter of land policy decision. Then April 2000, Operator G requested a review of the Town Planning Board's decision on its planning application, and the DH suggested that the planning department should consider refuting Operator G's argument, blah blah blah. But because here it is said that Operator G wanted to have the residential development to support the development of the hospital, and the DH suggested that the operator should seek other venues to raise funds. And then the undeveloped land, according to DH, should be reserved for future development on hospital services in the long run, as often seen in other hospital projects. And then June 2000, this is important because in June 2000, Town Planning Board agreed to the rezoning. So Planning Department sought DH's comments on Operator G's rezoning request, and DH had no particular comment, but its previous comments were still valid. In other words, DH still felt that the site should be reserved for future development of hospital services. Then August 2000, Planning Department sought DH's view on objections received on the rezoning request. Then DH indicated that it had already expressed its reservations on the change of land use. So I'll pause here, Chairman. Ms. Ophelia Wong, the Deputy Director, gave us an account of what happened. And with regard to June 2000 and August 2000, why was it that the expert advice of the DH was not attached importance to? Why was it that the Town Planning Board brushed aside the DH's advice and decided to approve the rezoning application? Now, do you want the expert to give an answer first, or do you want the layman to give an answer first? Maybe Planning Department. All right, Ms. Wong. At the time we received the DH's comments, we knew that the DH had reservations about the rezoning request. As Mr. Leung has pointed out, the operator said that the residential development was to cross-subsidize the operation of the hospital, which was running at a loss. But then DH was of the view that the applicant did not provide data, for example, the losses incurred, how much of the proceeds from residential development would be used to cross-subsidize the operation of the hospital, and so on and so forth. And the DH pointed out that the financial accounts of the hospital were not presented to the Town Planning Board for its consideration. And also at that time, the DH pointed out that it did not really see a compelling and urgent need to provide the extra 200 beds. But then DH was of the view that the proposed change of land use was more a matter of land policy decision. Now, in Hong Kong, when we do planning, when we make decisions on land matters, we can't be rigid. Now, in fact, change in land use can be allowed wherever suitable, because we do need to flexibly make use of our land resources to respond to changing needs in society. So the Town Planning Board did not take into account the financial dimension. In fact, the hospital did not provide the financial accounts or figures to the Town Planning Board for its consideration. As I have pointed out, the Town Planning Board was of the view that the site was privately owned, and the grantee had already discharged its obligations under the grant or the lease. And the board also took into account the supply and demand of private hospital beds, and the site was suitable for development of residential units. And also there would be the extra benefit of having 200 additional beds. And as a result, the Town Planning Board, having considered all these factors, decided to approve the application. I want to emphasize that at that time, the DH explained the reasons for its reservations, and Town Planning Board did take those concerns into account. DH, do you have anything to add? No. Mr. Alan Leung. I want to know whether that was the time when Mr. Tong Chi-wah wanted to achieve the target of 85,000 flats a year. Did that policy play a part in this matter? Ms. Wong, that was 1999 and in the year 2000. And at that time, there were concerns in Hong Kong that there was a shortage of flat supply. Mr. Alan Leung. Now, in April year 2000, the DH as the guardian of public health and hospital services in Hong Kong, said that the undeveloped land should be reserved for future development of hospital services in the long run, as often seen in other hospital projects. I don't know why the Town Planning Board did not attach importance to the DH's expert advice. And then I've got a question for the DD planning. As Mr. Kenneth Leung has pointed out, the site was sold to G for hospital use. So it was sold as a hospital site. And my understanding is like this, and correct me if I'm wrong. And normally the government would not regain possession and retender the site or sell it again. So in other words, when the owner applied for change of land use, and of course a premium had to be paid, and lessee would get a lot of benefits, and such benefits are not shared by other developers. Of course, we have discussed previously the formula for calculating a premium and so on and so forth. But I want to say whether in allowing the rezoning application, you were in fact giving benefits in inverted commas to the lessee or to the landowner. Didi, in fact, I've searched the records. I understand that questions have been asked of the Lands Department. I want to say that the land regime and the planning regime are two separate regimes. Ours is a statutory regime. In some cases, even though we may have some planned zonings or uses, the applicants may not be able to get the green light from the Lands Department. And so concerning change of use, change of land use zoning, land policy is not one of our considerations. Perhaps the Lands Department can supplement with regard to the so-called benefits.
Many private sites It's not just about hospital use. There are many private sites which can be sold on to another owner, and that other owner may want to change the land use. Under the town planning ordinance, an application can be submitted. And after this is done, lease modification is another process, because there are other technical considerations that we need to take on board, and also the premium must be paid in full. Premium has to be paid before lease modification is effected. Without payment of premium, the process will not be complete. So I don't think we are conferring benefits to anyone through the process. We are all working in accordance with the process. For Table 5, H tells us the premium that was paid. Chairman, from what I've heard from Ms. Wong, the Deputy Director of Planning, when the Town Planning Board discussed the rezoning request, they quoted the HA's views. And that is the number of beds is not just based on the Hong Kong planning standard and guidelines, and they will take a macro view and look at the situation in the districts. So the HA's comment and the DH comments were both presented to the Town Planning Board. So according to the Deputy Director of Planning, that you prefer the views of HA to those of DH. If that's true, what were the justifications? I've checked the records. Actually, according to the documents, both sets of comments were noted by the Town Planning Board. HA representatives attended the hearing. Only they were represented. So that make a difference. Mr. Kenneth Leung, do you have anything else? If not, then Ms. Ellen Leung, and then we can wrap up this particular part. Mr. Chan Ha Kan, a moment ago, pointed out to us, and also pointed out to the witnesses, that if we look at it now, in Sha Tin, in Zone District G, there's a lack of sufficient hospital beds now. You may think this is just saying something with the benefit of hindsight. So would you not agree that the decision made by the Town Planning Board in 2000 was somewhat divorced from reality? Because if you look at the HA figures, and more than 10 years now, and we look back, maybe there was a lack of foresight. Deputy Director of Planning, if I understand the case like this, or if I offer my observation like this, and that is at the time the Town Planning Board preferred to adopt the HA's views and not the DH views. It was rather short-sighted, and the decision was not sound. Can you offer anything from what you know, or what you knew, or what you have found out from the records, and your understanding of the Town Planning Board's decision and so on? If you think that my observation is somewhat unfair, please try to tell us why. Ms. Wong. From what I understand, and also under our planning guidelines and standards, well, there are clear provisions. The provision of hospital beds is done on a regional or district basis. Well, there are clear guidelines, and it's clearly set out that this is something for the hospital authority and the planning department. So when we talk about the provision of hospital beds, we should always ask the HA. From the Secretary for Development, we have heard that incident G is not going to repeat itself. Such an observation is based on the rationale or the arguments that in granting new sites for private hospitals, the leases will be well taken care of to prevent this. If we look at note 24, it mentions that in the 2 recent tenders for private hospital development, there are restrictions on gross floor area and height limits. So I want to ask the 2 secretaries, you are saying that we are going to see a recurrence. We are not going to see a repeat of the Hospital G incident. Are you basing your observation on note 24, and that is that there will be restrictions on gross floor area and height limits, or are there other reasons that that you can rely on to say that there will be no recurrence? Which secretary? Dr. Ko? Let me try. As I said, now we are very concerned about the supply of land for public and private hospitals. Therefore, we would pay close attention to sites that are available for hospitals. The mechanism would require the Bureau's input and views, and will provide our views as appropriate. And we are very concerned about hospital beds now. I think the question is, apart from GFA and height limits, are there any objective constraints other than those in note 24 that you can rely on? I think it's what Mr. Leung is asking. Are there other factors that can set our mind at ease? Any other measures or the system that we can rely on? Mr. Paul Chan. For future sites to be granted, of course, the new mechanism will be applied, and also the planning department would impose certain restrictions to effectively prevent a repeat of this incident. As for existing private hospitals, that depends whether the sites are owned by these private hospitals, whether they are landowners, and also whether they have developed their sites to the full. So it's difficult to generalize here. Dr. Ko, actually I already made this some time ago. With regard to the 2 of the 4 sites for private hospitals which have been put up for tendering, the tender document contains a clause on change of land use. The lease will specify that the sites must be mainly used for hospitals and ancillary support facilities. During the validity of the land lease, the government will not have allowed any change of land use. I think this is the answer I'm looking for. This is something that you can enforce. It's a clause that you can enforce. Chairman, from the incident of G, we may make the following observations. Maybe the 2 secretaries can see if you can provide more information to us, so that when we write our report, while we may criticize the approach adopted back then, we can be more forward-looking. And we can provide something assuring to the public. I think the first point, the first loophole exposed is in the planning stage. In the planning stage, there are inadequacies, such as The site is 1.922 hectares. That's bigger than the land required for a 400-bed hospital, and you provide them this room to maneuver. As Mr. Raymond Wong has put it, you have already provided a loophole for forward or far-sighted developer to exploit. So you must be more forward-looking. The first lesson to learn. Do you want them to respond to your observations one by one? Or I would like to state my observations first. It seems that there is a segregation or compartmentalization of the departments. So I would like to state my observations. Point number one, the planning stage is not done stringently enough. If it's for special purpose, it's for hospital, you should just calculate the site required strictly. Why do you give them this room to maneuver? Second, the lease does not contain any proper development control. Dr. Cole's point suggests that you are dealing with this point now because of this incident. Well, the point is the development control is not written in the lease. Maybe the planning department and the two secretary may wish to supplement with more information. Shouldn't you have come up with more stringent control measures to control the land use of the sites so granted? When Mr. Kenneth Leung raised his questions, we had this discussion. The land was granted. Can we say that we are going to take it back that after a few years? Well, the land was already sold, but you may think that this is a trump card, but that may not be that may not be the necessary conclusion. That is to say, if you are not going to use the land for the original intended purposes, be it a hospital or a school, you should not benefit the developer. The land should be resumed for retendering or another auction. How you're going to draft the clauses is another matter. I would like to hear from the planning department and the two directors of bureaus on whether we should take up these 3 points to exercise more control. Planning department, Ms. Wong. Thank you. With regard to Mr. Leung's observation that whether we should have been more stringent in the planning stage, it was pointed out that 1.922 hectare was too big. As I explained to you, the practice nowadays is to analyze each site very carefully and set the parameters. And we will also have the bulk decided for each blocks. There will be stringent building heights and site coverage requirements. If these parameters are set down clearly, then there's little chance to have any loophole. That's point number one. Second, there should be suitable development control clauses in the lease, as explained earlier. Back then, in the 1980s, in respect of Hospital G, the land lease was drafted in such a way that flexibility was the prime consideration. The important thing nowadays is the GFA and the building height, and we're now doing this. As I've said, we are putting in these parameters. If there's development control, would there be a waiver and that can be applied with a premium? Well, when there's a public need to change land use, they can apply to the lands department. As for the premium to be paid, I would defer to Ms. Lin. Point number 3. If the land is not going to be used for the original purpose, can the land be put up for auction again? Well, this has to do with what you have said, Chairman. There's also a land lease question, and I'll defer to Ms. Ling again. Ms. Ling, your turn. Mr. Leung asks whether the site was too big, whether there was a slip in the planning stage. As I said, we refer to the code on planning. If we wanted a 400-bed hospital, that it would require a site of comparable site. Mr. Leung suggests that we should have more stringent clauses in the lease. We can do this in terms of land use, and as the Secretary for Food and Health, we have such conditions for new leases. Any supplement from the two secretaries? Or nothing from me, nothing to add, but I would say that looking ahead for the future, as I've said repeatedly, when we invite tenders for hospitals, and this is related to the new EXCO requirements approved in 2011, and Ms. Wong of the Planning Department has already told you the current practice. So allow me to repeat the point that chances will be very slim for a recurrence. As for the existing hospitals, well, a lot would depend on the sites concerned. If they own the sites, as landowners, let's say they don't want to run the hospital anymore, and they want to demolish the hospital for residential development, let's say, that would be a different matter. Then we'll have a look at the planning for that particular zone or district, whether residential development is allowed according to the zoning. If not, an application has to be submitted to the Town Planning Board. It's a town planning process, which is a transparent process. At different stages, the public can offer comments, and the comments will be considered in a suitable manner. It's not easy that rezoning would be granted.
And concerning land not owned by him, in other words, land granted by private treaty, then basically the conditions of grant are followed. And this morning, as the D of H pointed out, that enforcement to ensure compliance with conditions of grant would be stepped up. But then, of course, when we when we are thinking of major alterations, this can only be done in the renewal of the grant. Mr. Alan Leung. Now, one of the conclusions we need to draw is in relation to the 1.922 hectares, whether that's some excessive provision. We really need to consider what Ms. Ling has said. And may I refer to a paragraph that I have read out, and that's paragraph 4.10. I read out this as a comparison. Audit noted that Hospital F, a non-profit making private hospital, was granted PTG sites of 0.79 hectares only for developing a hospital which provided not less than 300 beds. So, in fact, only 1.6 hectares should have been allocated, but the figure was 1.922 hectares. So, was there over allocation? So, Ms. Ling, do you think a reasonable allowance was provided? Chairman, the DD of planning can correct me if I am wrong. With regard to paragraph 4.10, mention was made of another hospital, how much land it was allocated. The planning standards represented only a guideline. And then 1.9 hectares for a 400-bed hospital, whether that's excessive, whether that amounts to over-allocation. Now, but at the time, the planning standard was 50 square meters per bed. And if we do the multiplication, 400 beds would give you the figure 2 hectares. So, that was about right, but I was not trying to compare Hospital G with other hospitals. I was just looking at the planning standard. So, in fact, that was under provision for F. Is that right? Mr. Allen Leung? All right, so we will adopt this answer and we'll come to our own conclusions. And I think I want the Secretary for Development to reply now because it's a policy issue. Now, for G, this is a hospital site. What if operator G doesn't want to operate a hospital anymore? What if it wants to develop residential units? So it will apply for rezoning, and it may need to pay a premium, but then other developers will not be able to develop on this site. So can you in the lease include a provision to the effect that if the site in the future is no longer used for the intended use, then say for example the 46%, then the government can buy back the site, buy back the 46% of the site at the initial price, because now people get the impression that the government over-allocated land to the developer. The developer was most forward-looking, and he knew that he could discuss the premium issue with you, say after a decade or so, behind closed doors. That's what I mean. Now, concerning the premium, does the premium always reflect the open market price, or is it that usually premium is calculated on a concessionary or at a concessionary rate because it is negotiated behind closed doors? Secretary, I understand that for the new grants, new hospital sites, EXCO's policy is that no change of land use will be allowed. But for existing sites, industrial sites, hospital sites, if one wants to apply for a change of land use, one has to go through the town planning procedures. But therefore, the new sites, no change in use is allowed. But will that policy be too rigid? I want to know whether this is a policy that has been made known already, or is this policy still under deliberation in EXCO? Have you disclosed something that you should not have disclosed? That's a policy decided by EXCO in 2011. All right, thank you. But of course, it's difficult to satisfy both purposes. I want to see whether I've omitted any point. Mr. Kenneth Leung, do you have anything you wish to supplement? No, not on this section. I believe I've asked all the questions. Maybe it's because it's Saturday afternoon, we don't have all the members. Some members have left, and I think we can have a 5-minute break now, and I'll invite the chairman to come back to chair the meeting for the last section. A 5-minute break.